I've been asked to speak this morning on lessons from research on faith leaders during COVID-19. And before I kind of launch into that, I'm going to be talking a bit about the project that many of you know I will have been working on in partnership with the Irish Council of Churches and the Irish Interchurch meeting. But I just wanted to say a little bit about the context of secularization before I kind of launch in. I mean, I suppose sociologists of religion in the West, one of the things that you are almost required to study is secularization, right? Because that's the one of the prevailing trends that seems to go along with modernization. And reflecting on that, there are a couple trends that also seem to go along with secularization, I suppose, that are worth mentioning. And the first one I have up here is this secularization and interchurch cooperation. Some recent work by Steve Bruce, a British sociologist, has traced how in Britain, as secularization, I suppose, increased and church going declined and that sort of thing, interchurch cooperation actually increased. So there was a sense, if you want to call secularization a common enemy, there was it can almost in some contexts be seen as a impetus to more interchurch cooperation. It seems in such contexts the differences between churches maybe become less important, and there is a spur towards cooperation. So, I mean, that's an interesting thing, I think, to hold in our minds. This is a trend we've seen elsewhere. And, in other countries as well. You can think of cases where smaller denominations have united into united churches, the United Reformed Church and so forth. This has happened in the UK, Canada, elsewhere. Yet at the same time, even in wider contexts of secularization, there is still evidence that religion helps people cope in times of stress. So, work by what's his first name? Richard Inglehart. Is that his? I've got his book here. Ronald Inglehart, as I crane to see his first name. He talks about secularization as being linked to existential security. So the more prosperous and secure a society feels, the less interested it is in religion. And you can see societies that are less affluent and quite unequal are more likely to be religious. There's a correlation. Yet at the same time, if there are situations of trauma, etc., even in societies that seem less religious, religion may still be turned to help people cope or to help people find meaning in the suffering and so forth. And Engelhardt has even written recently on the pandemic as being a possible uh, impetus to slow secularization in some contexts or even reverse it. He's one of the few that sees room for reversal of secularization. A lot of theorists of secularization would see it as an inevitable process that will just happen everywhere. But Engelhardt isn't quite that strong on it, and he would talk about conditions where it may be slowed or reversed, although trends continue in various countries according to their historical relationships with religion, I suppose. Um, and this idea of religion helping people cope with difficult times. There have been a few surveys conducted in both Ireland and the UK, not just a survey I've done in partnership with ICC, but by Tear Fund, Christian Aid, Durham University, York St. John University. There's quite an extensive list that show that more people than would be expected in both contexts are kind of accessing religion online or showing an increased interest in spirituality as well. And that would go along, I suppose, with Englehart's idea that crisis and trauma can be a spur to um, people to become more interested in religion or God or spirituality or whatever. So that kind of context of increased secularization and the idea that that can sometimes be a spur to interchurch cooperation, and the idea that something as traumatic as a pandemic may prompt people to explore spirituality. You could say that that could be framed as an opportunity for churches, and in some ways, I mean, that sounds maybe a bit crass in terms of um, the suffering obviously that comes with a pandemic. Yet at the same time, it is, I suppose, churches' missions to respond to trauma as well. So that's just a wee bit of context. And now for the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to give a brief overview of some of the key findings from the research, the survey of faith leaders that was conducted in May last year, and then the interviews that I carried out between June and December. And I'm aware that some of you will have read the reports or parts of the reports as well. And then at the end, there'll just be some time for reflections and questions. So the Survey of Faith Leaders, this is the report that was published in May. A few things to say. The questions on the survey were shaped in partnership with a group of key clergy and laity that was organized by the Irish Council of Churches. And, we agreed to ask questions around themes like pastoral care, moving religion online, serving the wider community, and I suppose the stress that ministers were under. Those were the four main areas. And then it was distributed via ICC, IICM member channels, so denominational offices, diocesan offices, etc. You can see the response rates there for the various denominations. Yay, Methodists, the 37%. I always have to give the Methodists a shout out. Every survey I've ever done, they have the highest response rate. So maybe they check with their Methodist email addresses, I don't know. But anyway, that's a very good response rate for the Methodists. So any findings specific to them, we can speak with pretty good confidence on it. But then the other response rates are not, are not bad either, particularly Church of Ireland and Presbyterian and so forth. I couldn't really calculate response rate for Catholic religious orders and for others, so some of the smaller ICC denominations and so forth. I wasn't confident that the email addresses that we had were necessarily right for some of the Catholic religious. And then we got answers back from some denominations and so forth. I wasn't even sure how they got the survey, so I didn't want to calculate response rate for the other Christian denominations and the religious, but the results are still included. I just don't have an accurate response rate. So some of the key findings, pastoral care, and again, keep in mind this is clergy self-reporting on people in their congregations and parishes, but 89% said they thought faith had helped people cope with stress during the pandemic. Some reported that people were praying more, and this I thought was quite significant because we didn't ask a question about prayer on the survey, and enough people wrote that in as something significant that it really caught your attention. People also wrote in about the shift to online, postal, phone, and outdoor provision of pastoral care. Somebody on a walk or in a garden, writing letters. In addition to all the online stuff. And the most common challenges that were reported amongst their flocks were loneliness, reduction in wages, bereavement, disruption of study, sickness, depression, etc. And keep in mind that this was in May, so it's a long time since May, so I doubt any of these common challenges have gotten much better as time has gone on. Then we asked questions about the move of religion online, and the figures here were quite stark. So across all faith communities that responded, the provision of online services or opportunities increased from 56% to 87%. And then we asked a question about whether faith leaders plan to retain some aspects of online ministry, and 70% said yes. And I've broken it down actually by denomination as well. And apologies to the smaller denominations for being lumped into other. But the response numbers weren't really big enough, to make meaningful percentages on their own. So you can see that some denominations like Church of Ireland Methodist went from very low base, 24-25%, very high up to 88-90% of congregations offering online services and so forth. Pretty much quite dramatic increases across the board. Again, I'm not quite sure entirely why the Catholic religious figure seems to decline. It may be something to do about the particular people who responded, but I'm not entirely sure about that. I think it probably was that a lot of the religious were already live streaming, and then maybe some aspects of their other online ministries maybe did not continue, but I can't be sure for certain on that. But the increase is pretty impressive, I think, and reflects the urgency that faith communities felt to getting an online presence. Also really interesting was we asked about who is responsible for the online provision during the pandemic. So we wanted to get a sense of how much was sort of falling on ministers and priests alone, or whether there was volunteers and paid staff. helping out. And you can see, there's at the top of the table, it shows everything combined, all faith communities. And then there are differences when you break it down by denomination. So Church of Ireland at 40% are the most likely to be solely responsible for online provision. And then Presbyterians at 30% after that. But at the same time, you can see, well, say in the Catholic, diocesan and religious, they're less likely to be solely responsible. But when you look at the volunteers, you can see that there's more volunteerism within some of the Protestant traditions. So like 40% of Presbyterian ministers then are assisted by volunteers with the online provision and so forth. And 31% of the Church of Ireland are assisted by volunteers, 45% of Methodists and 43% of others. And this is a trend that was found in other questions on the survey and also reported in the write-in thing about increased volunteerism amongst lay people. And one of the key areas where they were volunteering more was helping with online provision. And then the questions we asked about social services in the wider community, we wanted to get a sense of what churches and faith communities were doing out there on the ground. And we found that 74% from the big four, so that's the four largest denominations, Catholic, Church of Ireland, Presbyterian, Methodists, were continuing to provide social services during the pandemic for the wider community. And 42% said they had increased services, 33% stayed the same, and only 25% decreased, which I think that's a pretty good indicator of resiliency and robustness. And we found later in interviews, some of the cases where service had decreased. It might be a case where people had literally had to close their church hall and they couldn't offer the service safely anymore as well. So plenty of evidence that the churches were continuing that mission of service to the wider community. And then in terms of stress in ministry, some of the main findings around that, unsurprisingly, I suppose, I thought it might have been a higher number, right? 46% said ministry was more stressful than usual, 33% about the same, and 21% less stressful. Methodists were the most likely to say their ministry had been more stressful at 58%, but they were also second most likely to say they had coped with stress better at 32%. And the Catholic religious were first in that at 33%. And I haven't put all the data up because you can't cover it all in 15 minutes, but the Methodists as well were more likely to say they'd gotten support and information from their denomination. So that probably correlates with coping with stress better, the kind of the centralized approach the Methodists had with their district superintendents in terms of distributing information. I think that seemed to help with that coping aspect within Methodism. So a few thoughts on that. There's a quote from a Methodist minister that was written in on the survey, which says, "We can't go back to how we were." And I think that kind of captures a lot of what came through in the survey, a sense that things had sort of been forced to change so much during the pandemic that it had opened people's eyes about how church could change or perhaps should change. And some of that was the increase in online religious practice. People were reporting, far higher views of people accessing services than they would have expected. So this was, I suppose, viewed quite positively, as you might expect. And people were surprised by this. People also reported improved interaction and new opportunities for pastoral care, in some ways facilitated through online interactions with people. You could get more done more quickly in some cases, that presented new opportunities, and also an openness of people talking about difficult issues during the pandemic. There's a new appreciation for faith leaders reported. I think an appreciation about their role in conducting funerals and comforting the bereaved and that sort of thing. And the title of the first report, "People Still Need Us," I think reflects the theme that came through of this new appreciation for faith leaders. And again, the greater involvement of lay people in aspects of service in the church, not just with online provision. That also was a theme that came through, and all these things taken together are trends maybe of indicating that, we just can't go back to the way things were. Um, then the second phase of the project was interviews. And this is the report based on the interviews that was just published in January, called Something Other Than a Building. And the interviews took place between June and December last year. And you can see the denominational breakdowns there. So 10 Catholic, 7 Church of Ireland, 5 each from Methodist, Presbyterian, and other. And 14 from the Republic, 11 from Northern Ireland, and 7 from border counties, and 7 of those were staff. Staff that could include bishops or people in similar positions within the Protestant denominations. And interviewing that staff category allowed to get, I suppose, a broad overview of what people in those positions saw happening and was reported, back to them as well. And the interviews are really opportunity to discuss issues raised in the surveys in a bit more depth. And again, what emerged from the survey, some of the key findings, this idea of new conceptions of church. And that's really what the title of the report is trying to get at, something other than a building. And again, this was a quote from one of the interviews, a Presbyterian minister who said that people have been forced to think of church as, something other than a building, not just a place where you come and there's an event on Sunday or Wednesday night or whatever, but it's churches online, it's in the streets, it's everywhere, it's not confined by the walls. So this idea, are there new conceptions of church being developed? Now, as many of you know, these conceptions of church have been around for a long time, but it's just, I think the point being made was that maybe more people were starting to think this way or realize this. Again, more coming about more volunteers and volunteers who step forward also when churches reopened to assist with that. Excuse me. Creative responses like some of the drive-in services that were held in different parts of the island, blended online in-person worship as well when some places went back and churches opened. Some places had booking systems for mass or church services to make sure people could get in and not be turned away. Also, interview themes raised were the digital divides, urban, rural areas, internet access isn't great. And so that could be a bit of a struggle. Sometimes the elderly struggled, but again, there were lots of stories about the elderly not struggling or being assisted by their children or grandchildren to get online. Also some digital divides with immigrant majority congregations. So when I spoke to ministers from immigrant majority churches, some mentioned, people struggling for internet access or data running out in the middle of a service, as well. So although the online thing, I think, has been very positive, there are still these digital divides that haven't gone away. And the reopening of church buildings found that, obviously the first survey didn't cover that, but that proved to be a major source of stress for priests and ministers. And that theme came through very clearly in the interviews. One person said, you couldn't please everybody. If you opened then, it was too early. If you opened then, it was too late. And then when you did open, people didn't want to, follow the arrows. And, so it was quite stressful for a lot of people trying to balance health and safety with spiritual needs. So some lessons from all of this: are there new opportunities that now exist for the churches in the midst of all the kind of changes that have been happening with the pandemic? Well, another thing that came out in the surveys was this unprecedented national level church cooperation. So this was one of the aspects that I highlighted in the report, like the Church Leaders Group and, organizations like ICC and the Irish Interchurch Meeting seem to be really meeting on a more frequent basis, being seen to do things together, particularly around responding to the pandemic and the support for, public safety measures and coordination to a degree of opening churches and so forth. So I even think I wrote in the report that this was probably a historic high of cooperation amongst the Irish churches. And if you think back to what I said earlier, about some of the work in Britain as well in that context of secularization, some of it fits, I think, probably with that, but has been maybe accelerated or prompted by the crisis of the pandemic as well. I think it's very clear that online ministries are going to be part of church life going forward. You know, we can't go back to where we were to remind you of that quote. I also think there is evidence of intensification of practice among the faithful. So, you know, the idea of religion helping people find meaning or to cope during a traumatic time comes through in this, and that's supported, you know, by the high levels of engagement with online forms of church, an increase in prayer as well. Um, there are several of surveys that have been done in Ireland and also the UK show increases of people saying they pray, you know, so it's not just my survey where the ministers are saying they think people are praying more. There have been national level surveys where people themselves have seemed to confirm this. So there's that tentative evidence of seeking in these other Irish and UK surveys. At the same time, fears of decline and loss, I think, persist in the churches. People are worried that some people are just never going to go back to church. And I think that probably is the case. Um, some people will be afraid for a long time to go back to church. So that's part of it. Um, and as we know, churchgoers are an older cohort, and the people of that older cohorts have been more likely to die during the pandemic as well. So that is actually probably going to affect church attendance. That sounds really grim, but it's a demographic fact. And then the Iona Institute did a survey in the Republic where it said 25% of people who went to Mass before don't know if they are ever going to come back. And that sort of caused a bit of hand wringing. So there's that kind of fear that some people will never come back as well. But, you know, then where does that fit with that evidence of intensification amongst some of the faithful? You know, it's kind of a mixed picture, I suppose. So I suppose for me, it comes down to, you know, churches have choices in the midst of the current situation that we're in, that wider context of secularization preceding it and continuing during the pandemic as well. So some of these studies in the Ireland and the UK do hint at return to religion. But one thing I think is quite significant is that, you know, when I was speaking to clergy in those interviews, and it came through in the survey as well, some clergy are framing the pandemic as an opportunity. And so this idea that, you know, churches aren't passive agents in this wider process of secularization. Churches, faith communities can respond to secularization, you know, and if they are seeing it as an opportunity to make a contribution to wider society and to serve their own members better, you know, as an opportunity can be seized, as it were. You know, that's, I guess, one of my key points is, you know, you're not passive victims in this. You know, there can be responses to it, and churches can work within that framework as well. So there, I did detect that a bit of enthusiasm, I suppose, with clergy framing the pandemic as an opportunity. It's even I was being interviewed for a radio program, and someone was like, the presenter was like, "Was there anybody who was discouraged?" I'm like, "Well, I'm sure there was," but you know, the overwhelming response was this idea of opportunity, I think. But I also think that this enthusiasm is probably starting to dissipate. You know, my interviews, most of them were closer to June than to December. So weariness has taken hold and will continue to take hold, you know, so that could be a factor. And again, with some people never returning to church, I think it could be easy to get discouraged. So this is my last slide, and the questions I want to leave you with around this idea that churches have choices. The first one is, you know, we've talked about this historic high of national level interchurch cooperation, but how can that national level leadership become more radical or visible in this context? You know, perhaps emphasizing the common good and not just church interests or issues that are associated with the churches. The second one there is, how can churches adopt effective blended approaches, you know, so the online in-person thing, and have less emphasis maybe on buildings and events, you know, kind of an events-based Christianity rather than a full holistic Christianity. And the third one there, how can new volunteers be nurtured or recruited, especially young people? And the final one there, how can churches respond to increased pressure on laity? Because I think there's no question that there has been increased pressure on clergy. during the pandemic. And so how might laity help with that and reduce some of that pressure? So thanks very much for your attention. That's me.